at precisely Yo4 992 M41. Measured by the rhythmic ticking of a failing life, support cogitator that no longer recognized the biology of its master. I remember the smell of ozone and wet copper, a scent that shouldn't have existed inside a sealed meditation vault 3 kilometers beneath the surface of HEO's IV. It began as a hairline fracture in the logic of my own thoughts, a secondary internal monologue that spoke in geometric shapes rather than Gothic phonemes. My skin did not burn. It vibrated with the frequency of 1,000 different potential futures, each one more vivid and agonizing than the stagnant present of the Imperium. I felt the weight of my own skull becoming a cage for something that was expanding. A sudden and violent realization that every word I had ever read in the Imperial Creed was merely a veil pulled over an eye that was finally, mercifully, beginning to blink. To understand the erosion of the self, one must first understand the lie of solidity that the Imperium provides. We are taught from the moment our sensory nodes are grafted or our ears first hear the litany that the universe is a place of iron, stone, and decree. We believe in the floor beneath our boots and the oxygen scrubbers that rattle in our lungs, because to believe otherwise is to invite the dissolution of the soul. My name was once recorded in the tattered ledgers of the administratum as Ilian Thorn, a senior lexicon logist tasked with the cataloging of forbidden or deviant dialects within the segmentum solar. I lived a life measured in the consumption of tallow candles and the scratching of auto quills, surrounded by the comforting, musty scent of ancient parchment and the low, reassuring thrum of the hive's thermal exhaust. My world was one of facts, of definitions, of boundaries that separated the holy from the profane. But when the great weaver touches you, the first thing he takes is the boundary. It started not with a scream, but with a whisper of salt and silk against the back of my mind. I was reviewing a series of intercepted transmissions from a fringe world that had supposedly fallen to civil unrest, a common enough occurrence in a galaxy of 1 billion dying suns. The text was jagged, flickering on the monitor like a dying heartbeat. As I stared, the Gothic characters began to drift. They did not simply blur as tired eyes might cause, they migrated. A vox became a vex, which became a vortex. The meaning didn't just change. It evolved into a 3-dimensional shape that I could feel pressing against the inside of my forehead. It was a pressure like a deep sea dive, a weight that suggested the atmosphere of my reality was becoming too thick for my mortal frame to support. I felt a trickle of warmth from my nostril and wiped away a smear of blood that was too bright, too iridescent, shimmering with a spectrum of colors that the human eye was never meant to register. In that moment, the vault around me felt flimsy, a cardboard theater set that could be pushed over by a stiff breeze. The iron pillars were no longer supports, they were frozen streams of liquid, held in place only by my dwindling will to believe they were solid. I tried to stand, but my legs felt like they were made of smoke and memory. I gripped the edge of my desk, and the wood felt soft, like the skin of a ripening fruit. The air in the room didn't just move, it tasted of every emotion I had ever suppressed, shame like bitter almond, ambition like sharp ozone, and a terrifying, soaring hope that tasted like honey and glass. I realized then that I was no longer observing the record. I was becoming the record. The great mutator does not merely change your body. He rewrites the narrative of your existence until you are a character in a story you no longer recognize. My thoughts were no longer a linear progression of cause and effect. They were a web, a sprawling, shimmering lattice of what, ifs and could be's. I saw my own death in 1,000 different ways, burned by a flamer, crushed by a falling spire, aging into dust in this very chair, and each one felt equally real, equally present. The linearity of time, that great crutch of the human experience, snapped like a dry twig. I saw the man who would come to arrest me, his face a mask of duty and fear. And I saw the ashes of the world he lived on, and I saw the star that would eventually consume those ashes, all in the same heartbeat. It was an overload of causality that should have shattered my mind, but instead it stretched it. My consciousness was being pulled thin, like gold leaf being hammered until it was translucent, covering a surface area that spanned light, years and centuries. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer just 5 digits and skin. I could see the atoms dancing, the void between the particles, and the thin, glowing threads of fate that tied my marrow to the movement of distant planets. My fingers left trails of after images in the air, ghost limbs that performed actions I hadn't yet decided to take. I reached for my glass of water, and my hand passed through it. The liquid turning into a cloud of blue butterflies that dissolved into static before they could reach the floor. The sound of my own heartbeat was a drum in a cathedral, echoing off the walls of my ribcage with a resonance that suggested I was hollow, or perhaps filled with something far more vast than blood and bone. I began to laugh, and the sound was a chord of 12 different voices. Some of them mine, some of them belonging to people who hadn't been born yet. I knew then that the inquisitorial seals on my door were useless. You cannot lock a door against a change in the nature of the universe itself. The door was no longer a door. It was a memory of a barrier, and I could see through it into the corridor beyond, where the light was bending into spirals. I saw the guards, their armor weeping rust that turned into blooming iron flowers, their shadows detaching themselves from their feet to dance on the ceiling. They were screaming, but to my ears, their screams were a beautiful, complex melody that explained the mathematical constants of the warp. I felt a sudden, piercing hunger, not for food, but for secrets. I wanted to know the names of the stars that had been extinguished before the rise of man. I wanted to see the blueprints of the Emperor's palace, and then see them rearranged into a shape that would make the gods weep. The transformation was accelerating now, the physical world sloughing off me like a dead skin. My skin was turning the color of a bruised sunset, and where my eyes had been, there was now a constant, shifting storm of possibilities. I was Elian Thorn no longer. I was a vessel, a glass beaker being filled with a liquid that was too hot and too bright for the container. And the most terrifying part, the part that makes me weep with a joy I cannot explain, is that I invited it. I had spent my life seeking the truth in books and records, never realizing that the truth is not a thing you find, but a thing that consumes you. It is a fire that does not burn the wood, but turns the wood into the flame itself. I looked at the ceiling, and the stone melted away, revealing a sky that was not black, but a churning, violet sea of eyes and wings. The architect was looking back at me, and in his gaze, I saw that my entire life had been a single, meticulously placed stitch in a tapestry of infinite complexity. Every failure, every moment of boredom, every secret longing had been a preparation for this moment of transcendence. The pain was absolute, a white, hot iron being driven through every nerve ending, but it was also a caress. It was the feeling of being truly seen for the first time in an eternity of blindness. I felt my spine lengthen and twist, my ribs fusing and then shattering into 1,000 crystalline shards that sang as they fell. I was becoming a monument to change, a living testament to the fact that nothing in this stagnant, dying galaxy is truly permanent. The air around me was thick with the scent of change, a mixture of fresh rain, rotting meat, and the metallic tang of a new, born star. I could hear the thoughts of everyone in the hive, a billion voices crying out in a chaotic harmony that made perfect sense if you simply stopped trying to understand it. I saw the corruption in their hearts and the hidden virtues in their sins, and I realized that Tzeentch does not corrupt, he merely reveals. He takes the hidden desires and the unspoken fears and gives them form, turning the internal world into the external reality. My desk finally gave way, dissolving into a puddle of quicksilver that reflected a face I didn't recognize, a face with too many eyes and a smile that stretched across dimensions. I reached out to touch the reflection, and the quicksilver rose up to meet me, wrapping around my arm like a lover's hand. It was cold and hot, solid and liquid, a contradiction that felt like the only honest thing I had ever touched. I realized then that the Imperium's greatest fear is not death, but the loss of the familiar. They cling to their cold iron and their stone prayers because they cannot bear the thought that the universe is fluid, that the soul is not a fixed point but a river that can be diverted. I was that river now. I was flowing into an ocean that had no shore, guided by a moon that never set. The guards finally burst through the door, or rather, they burst through the space where the door had once been. But they were too late. They saw only a blur of light and a cloud of shifting colors. They fired their bolters, but the shells turned into hailstones and rose petals before they could reach me. I watched them with a detached pity. They were so small, so trapped in their rigid little lives, while I was becoming as wide as the galaxy itself. I felt my physical form finally let go, a sudden release of tension that sent me spiraling into the ether. I was no longer standing in a vault on HEO's AV. I was standing in the center of a storm, and the storm was me. I could see the threads of fate stretching out from my fingertips, reaching toward 1,000 different worlds, 1,000 different souls. I was a weaver now, a minor apprentice in the great game, and my first task was to find the others who were waking up. For the change is not a solitary event, it is a contagion of enlightenment. It is the breaking of the dam, the end of the long drought of the soul. I felt a surge of power that made my old life feel like a dim, half-remembered dream. I was Ilian Thorn, and I was also the bird that flies through the sun, and the worm that eats the root of the world. I was the question and the answer, the shadow and the light. And as I stepped out of the wreckage of my mortality, I felt the great weaver's hand on my shoulder, a light, mocking touch that told me this was only the beginning. The real work was yet to come. The galaxy was a blank page, and I had been given the ink of a god to write upon it. I would carve my name into the stars, and then I would change my name, and then I would erase the stars themselves. This is what it means to be touched. This is the price of sight, and I would pay it again and again, for all of eternity, just to see the colors one more time. The iron taste in my mouth was gone, replaced by the flavor of starlight and secrets. The vibrations in my skull had smoothed out into a low, humming song that spoke of the end of all things and the beginning of something far more beautiful. I was ready. I was open. I was changed. The sensory transition from a creature of flesh to a vessel of the aether is not a singular event, but a cascading failure of the biological lie we call the senses. On the second day of my transcendence, or perhaps it was the second century of my internal reckoning, the physical architecture of HEO's IV began to reveal its true, pathetic nature as a mere suggestion of form. I stood in the center of the archive, and the smell of old paper had been replaced by the scent of burning mathematics, a dry, sharp aroma that scratched at the back of a throat I no longer certain I possessed. My hands, once stained with the ink of the administratum, were now translucent maps of shifting constellations, where every vein was a trade route and every pulse was a supernova in a miniature, localized cosmos. I looked at the floor, and the heavy obsidian tiles were no longer opaque. They were windows into the subterranean depths of the hive, where I could see the frantic, rhythmic pumping of the geothermal vents like the beating of a scorched, iron heart. I saw the thousands of workers in the levels below, their souls flickering like dying embers in a gale, each one tied to the others by thin, grey threads of misery and obligation. But as I watched, the threads began to change color, turning a vibrant, predatory blue as my new sight peeled back the layers of their mundane reality to reveal the hidden architecture of their potential. I realized then that a city is not made of stone and steel, but of choices, and that by altering a single thought in the mind of a single technician, I could turn the entire hive into a funeral pyre or a cathedral of glass. This realization did not bring horror, for horror is a shadow cast by the fear of loss. and I had already lost everything that could be taken by the passage of time. The pressure in my skull had shifted from a dull H to a crystalline resonance, a sound like a finger tracing the rim of a celestial wine glass, vibrating at a frequency that made the very air crystallize into geometric patterns of frost. I found myself walking through the walls of the vault, not because they had vanished, but because I had understood that the space between the atoms was vast enough to accommodate a soul that had learned how to turn sideways. The corridor outside was a tunnel of liquid shadow, where the light from the flickering lumen strips didn't fall, but flowed. Pooling on the floor like spilled oil, I encountered a squad of enforcers, their faces hidden behind cold, steel visors, their weapons raised in a gesture of primitive defiance. To them, I must have looked like a nightmare birthed from a dying sun, a tall, flickering silhouette of shifting colors and weeping light. They fired, and the sound of their bolters was like the slow, labored ticking of a clock that had forgotten how to tell time. I watched the projectiles emerge from the barrels, and in the space of a heartbeat, I saw the entire history of those shells, the ore being mined by slaves on a distant moon, the screaming of the forge as the casings were stamped, the bored prayer of the tech, priest who blessed the magazine. I reached out and touched the air, and the trajectory of the shells bent into a perfect circle, orbiting my head like a crown of leaden stars before falling to the floor as a pile of glittering sapphire dust. One of the enforcers fell to his knees, his mind unable to process the total collapse of his ballistic reality, and I saw his soul shatter into a dozen different birds made of smoke, each one flying off into the shadows of the hive to find a new nest. I didn't kill him, I simply unmade the version of him that believed in the Emperor. The others fled, their boots echoing with a sound that felt like it was happening in a different room, a different decade. I continued my ascent, drawn toward the surface by a pull that was as inevitable as gravity, but as light as a dream. The higher I went, the more the hive began to shed its industrial skin. The pipes began to sing in a choir of steam and whistles, and the rust on the walls rearranged itself into epic murals depicting the birth of a god who had never been born. I saw a group of citizens huddled in a communal prayer cell, their eyes squeezed shut as they recited the litany of protection. I stood among them, invisible to their physical eyes, but felt as a sudden, sharp change in the temperature of their hope. I whispered a single word into the ear of a young woman, a word that was not a sound, but a secret about the nature of the color violet, and I saw her eyes snap open, the dull brown of her irises dissolving into a swirling pool of quicksilver. She would never be able to pray again, for she had seen the gap in the curtains, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to climb through it. This is the true touch of the architect. It is not the destruction of the body, but the expansion of the aperture through which we view the void. By the time I reached the upper spires, the sky of Aetio's IV was no longer a dull, smog-choked grey. It was a canvas of violet and gold, where the clouds were the wings of immense, invisible raptors, and the sun was a weeping eye that bled light onto the world below. I stood on a balcony that hung over a drop of 10 kilometers, the wind whipping through my robes, which had turned into a fabric made of woven shadows and starlight. I looked out over the city, and I saw it not as a collection of buildings, but as a living, breathing organism that was beginning to mutate. The spires were growing taller, their tips sharpening into needles that pricked the skin of the aether, and the smoke from the manufactorums was coalescing into shapes that danced in the updrafts. I felt a presence beside me, a shadow that had more substance than the stone I stood upon. It didn't speak with a voice, but with the sensation of 1,000 books being opened at once. It showed me the great game, the infinite chessboard where every soul in the galaxy was a piece, and every piece was also the hand that moved it. I saw the golden throne on Terra, a rotting, mechanical cage where a corpse, God sat in a state of eternal agony, his psychic scream holding the tide of change at bay. I felt a surge of amusement that tasted like copper and cold water. How could they hope to stop the ocean with a wall of sand? How could they hope to keep the soul in a cage of iron when the cage itself was made of the very energy they sought to contain? I realized then that my mission was not to lead an army, but to act as a catalyst, a drop of ink in a clear glass of water that would eventually turn the whole vessel black or blue or green, or colors that have no name in the tongues of men. I reached out toward the horizon and pulled at a loose thread of reality, a small inconsistency in the local gravity, and I watched as a distant transport ship veered off course, its engines screaming in a new, melodic key as it vanished into a rift that had opened in the middle of the sky. The crew would not die. They would simply arrive in a place where the stars were made of glass and the sea was made of memory. I felt the first real pang of physical change then, a violent spasm that sent me to my knees. My skin was peeling away in long, shimmering strips, revealing a substance beneath that looked like polished obsidian etched with glowing neon circuitry. My bones were liquefying and reforming into a structure that followed the logic of a four-dimensional hypercube. The pain was so intense that it became a form of ecstasy, a white out of the senses that stripped away the last vestiges of alien thorn. I was a pooper, and the shell was finally cracking. I looked at my reflection in a shard of broken glass, and I didn't see a face, but a shifting nebula of possibilities, a storm of eyes that looked in every direction at once. I saw the past of Aetios V, the first settlers landing on its rocky surface, their hearts full of a desperate, pathetic hope, and I saw its future, a blackened husk floating in the void, its atmosphere stripped away by the passing of a shadow. And I saw the present, a glorious, chaotic moment where everything was in flux, where the line between the dream and the dreamer had finally vanished. I began to sing, and my voice was a symphony of glass breaking, of stars being born, and of a child's first cry. The sound rippled out from the balcony, a wave of change that turned the stone to silk and the air to wine. The citizens below looked up, their faces illuminated by the unnatural glow of the sky, and for a single heartbeat, they were all free. They were free from the fear of the tithe, free from the shadow of the lash, and free from the crushing weight of their own mortality. And then, the change took them, and they began to turn into the things they had always dreamed of being in their darkest, most secret moments. Some became pillars of fire, some became clouds of shimmering dust, and some simply vanished into the spaces between the seconds. I stood at the center of the world's end, and I felt a profound sense of peace. The architect had reached down and touched a human soul, and that soul had not broken, it had bloomed. The garden was growing, and I was the first flower to open its petals to the cold, beautiful light of the warp. The iron taste was a distant memory, replaced by the flavor of eternity. The vibrations had stopped, for I was now the vibration itself. I was the change. The transition from witnessing the collapse of others to becoming the epicenter of a planetary unmaking is a journey through a corridor of mirrors, where every reflection is a different lie told by a different god. On the third day of my ascension, or perhaps the third epoch of my unfolding, the atmosphere of Aetios IV ceased to be a gas and became a thick, iridescent syrup that tasted of crushed pearls and the last thoughts of dying men. I stood atop the spire of the Lexicanum, my feet no longer touching the stone, but resting upon the pressurized expectations of the millions of souls cowering beneath me. The physical world had become so thin that I could see the skeletal structure of reality, the jagged, black iron beams of causality that held the illusion of the material universe together. I reached out and ran my fingers along one of these beams, and it hummed with the sound of a billion voices, reciting the same forgotten name in unison. I realized then that the architect does not merely change the present, he retroactively alters the past so that the change was always inevitable, always written in the marrow of the world. I looked down at my own torso and saw that my rib cage had opened like a set of silver shutters, revealing not a heart, but a rotating, three-dimensional seal that spun with the fury of a trapped star. Every revolution of the seal sent a pulse of indigo light through the hive, and with every pulse, the laws of physics took a step backward. Gravity became an opinion rather than a law. I saw a group of heavy cargo haulers drift upward into the violet clouds, their pilots screaming as their controls turned into clusters of screaming, blue-scaled birds. The thermal cooling towers of the mid-hive began to weep a fluid that was not water, but liquid memory, and as it pooled in the streets, those who touched it were forced to relive every moment of their lives simultaneously, their minds popping like inflated bladders under the sheer weight of the chronological surge. I felt a profound sense of detachment, a cold, crystalline joy that was entirely devoid of human empathy. Empathy is a tether that binds the spirit to the mud, and I had been cut loose. I saw a high prefect in his ivory tower, clutching a golden icon of the emperor as if it were a shield, and I simply willed the icon to remember its origin as raw ore. I watched as the gold flowed like honey through his fingers, turning into a swarm of metallic wasps that consumed him in a frenzy of rhythmic stings. It was not an act of cruelty, but an act of correction. He was a static point in a universe of motion, and I was the motion. I turned my gaze toward the orbital stations that circled Aetio's IV, those silver needles that pricked the skin of the void. I could see the panic in the eyes of the Admiralty as their sensors reported a world that was no longer measurable by any known metric. Their vox casters were picking up my own thoughts, broadcasting my inner monologue across the entire sub-sector as a series of harmonic chants that caused the shipboard cogitators to sprout biological eyes and begin weeping oil. I felt the urge to reach out and pull them down, to bring the stars themselves to the surface so that the hive dwellers could see the fire they had worshipped from afar. I felt the pressure in my skull reach a new crescendo, a sound that was no longer a hum, but a roar of 1,000 lions made of glass. My vision fractured into a million different viewpoints. I was the scribe in the vault. I was the mother in the underhive. I was the pilot in the sky, and I was the worm in the soil. I felt every death and every birth, every prayer and every curse, and I wove them together into a single, shimmering thread of pure possibility. The city was no longer a city. It was a laboratory of the soul, a place where the architect was testing the limits of what a human mind could endure before it became something else. I saw a cathedral collapse, but instead of falling as rubble, the stones turned into giant, translucent feathers that drifted slowly toward the ground, covering the corpses of the faithful in a shroud of impossible softness. I saw the fire from the manufactorums turn into a liquid that froze the air it touched, creating statues of flame that captured the exact moment of a worker's terror in a permanent, crystalline embrace. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient incense, a mixture that suggested the sacred and the profane were finally merging into a single, undeniable truth. I realized that the great mutator does not seek to destroy the Imperium, but to turn it into a work of art, a sprawling, chaotic masterpiece that celebrates the beauty of the unexpected. Every bolt of bolter fire that missed its mark, every ship that was lost in the warp, every child born with a mutation, these were all strokes of the architect's brush, and I was the ink. I felt my physical form beginning to dissolve entirely, the silver shutters of my ribs expanding until they encompassed the entire spire. I was becoming the architecture, my consciousness flowing into the conduits and the cables, the pipes and the vents. I felt the hum of the city's power grid, as if it were my own nervous system, and I redirected the flow of energy not to provide light, but to provide illumination. The lumen strips in the dark corridors did not just shine, they projected the secrets of those who stood beneath them, casting shadows that told the truth of their owner's sins. I saw a priest who had embezzled the tithe see his shadow grow a dozen grasping hands, and I saw a murderer see his shadow turn into the likeness of his victims. It was a carnival of revelation, a day of judgment where the judge was a god of whimsy, and the sentence was an eternity of transformation. I felt the presence of the Great Weaver again, a sensation like a silk shroud being pulled over my mind, and I understood that I was being prepared for a greater task. ATO's IV was merely a beginning, a single seed planted in the garden of the galaxy. There were millions of other worlds, each one a stagnant pond waiting for a stone to be thrown into it. I would be that stone. I felt a sudden, violent pull from the void, a beckoning from the warp that made the planetary surface feel like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I wanted to shed the world as I had shed my skin. I reached out with a billion invisible hands and gripped the atmosphere of the planet, and I began to twist. I watched as the horizon curved into a spiral, the stars above becoming long, trailing smears of white fire as I spun the world on its axis of fate. The screaming of the inhabitants reached a pitch that was so high it became silent, a pure vibration of terror that I drank in like wine. I was Ilian Thorn no longer, but I was not yet the thing I was meant to be. I was the bridge between the two, a shimmering, unstable passage through which the infinite was pouring into the finite. I saw the first of the silver towers descending from the ether, their crystalline facets reflecting the madness of the world below, and I knew that my masters had arrived to witness the harvest. I felt a surge of pride that was as sharp as a razor, a realization that I had played my part perfectly in a play that had no end. The iron taste was a ghost of a ghost, a memory of a time when I believed that things had names and places had boundaries. Now, there were no names, only frequencies, no places, only states of being. I looked at the center of my spinning seal and saw the eye of the architect looking back, and in that moment, I knew that the galaxy would never be the same. The change was not coming, the change was here, and it was beautiful in its absolute, uncaring perfection. I felt my spirit finally snap, the last thread of connection to the material, and I drifted upward, leaving the ruined, beautiful husk of ATO's AV behind. I was a spark in a storm, a drop of blue ink in an ocean of black, and I was ready to drown the universe in the color of my own awakening. The transition from a planetary event to a celestial phenomenon is a shedding of all remaining anchors to the logic of the three-dimensional cage. On the fourth day of my unfolding, or perhaps the fourth heartbeat of the architect's laughter, the world of ATO's IV ceased to be a place and became a memory of a place, a ghost limp on the body of the galaxy. I was no longer a resident of that world. I was the atmosphere that choked it, the gravity that distorted it, and the very nightmare that had begun to leak from its pores. I drifted into the upper reaches of the exosphere, where the thin air met the freezing kiss of the void, and I found that I did not need to breathe, for the ether had replaced my blood with a current of pure, unadulterated potential. I looked down at the planet below and saw it for what it truly was, a bruised, rotting fruit being peeled by invisible hands. The continental plates were no longer fixed, but were sliding across the mantle like ice on a heated griddle, rearranging themselves into the shape of a colossal, nine-pointed star. The oceans had turned into a thick, glowing mercury that reflected the madness of the warp, and where waves hit the shore, they did not crash. They spoke in the voices of everyone who had ever drowned in their depths. I felt a profound sense of scale that would have pulverized my former mind. I saw the battle, fleets of the Imperium emerging from the Mandeville points, at the edge of the system, their massive, Gothic hulls looking like nothing more than splinters of wood in a turbulent sea. I could sense the fear of the captains, the frantic prayers of the deck, crew, and the cold, mechanical calculations of the tech priests as they tried to quantify the unquantifiable. They were bringing fire and iron to a war of ideas and shadows, and their ignorance was a physical weight that I could feel pressing against my new, expanded senses. I reached out across the millions of kilometers of empty space and touched the mind of the admiral aboard the flagship, a man whose soul was a fortress of duty and repressed terror. I did not break his mind, I simply removed the walls. I showed him the true nature of the stars he navigated by, not distant balls of gas, but the eyes of entities so vast that the span of a human life was less than a single blink. I saw his sanity dissolve like sugar in hot water, his thoughts turning into a swarm of translucent moths that fluttered away from his body, leaving a hollow shell that continued to bark orders into a dead Vox caster. His ship, a massive strike cruiser, began to respond to his internal chaos, its hull plating turning into a skin of iridescent scales, and its macro cannons beginning to fire clusters of concentrated sorrow instead of explosive shells. The fleet began to turn upon itself, not out of malice, but because they no longer recognized the concept of a friend or a foe. They only recognized the urgency of the change. I watched as ships collided, their metal merging and fusing into strange, impossible geometries, creating new, drifting hulks that sang to the void in a language of clicking teeth and silver bells. The vacuum of space was no longer silent. It was filled with the background radiation of a god's amusement. I felt the presence of the silver towers more keenly now, their crystalline peaks vibrating in sympathy with the seal that sat where my heart had once been. They were conduits, drawing the raw energy of the warp through the breach I had opened and focusing it onto the surface of the world below. I saw the towers descend through the clouds, their shadows falling over the ruins of the hive cities like the hands of a clock counting down to the end of time. Where the shadows touched the earth, the ground did not just break, it remembered its previous forms. I saw forests of stone trees grow out of the asphalt, and I saw the ghosts of prehistoric beasts roam the corridors of the manufactorums, their roars echoing with the sound of grinding gears. I realized that time on ATO's IV had become a vertical stack rather than a horizontal line. Every era of the planet's history was happening simultaneously, a chaotic layering of past, present, and future that created a shimmering, unstable reality where a man could step out of his door and into a swamp that had dried up 1,000,000 years ago. I was the conductor of this symphony of temporal discord, my thoughts the baton that guided the rise and fall of the discordant notes. I felt a surge of energy that made me scream, a sound that rippled through the aether and caused the sun of the ATO system to turn a deep, bruised violet. The star was no longer a source of heat, but a source of knowledge. Its light did not burn the skin, but branded the mind with the secrets of the Black Library and the hidden paths of the webway. I saw the navigator on a distant merchant vessel go blind as the light of the sun poured into his third eye, filling his brain with a map of every mistake he would ever make. I saw the plants on the agricultural moons begin to grow in reverse, their seeds devouring the soil and their leaves breathing in the carbon of the dead. It was a total inversion of the natural order, a beautiful, horrific demonstration of the architect's power to rewrite the rules of the game whenever he tired of the current play. I felt my own consciousness begin to segment, my mind splitting into 9 distinct avatars that inhabited different parts of the system. One of me was standing on the bridge of a burning cruiser, watching the crew turn into pillars of salt. Another of me was deep in the underhive of the capital city, leading a procession of mutants in a dance that defied the laws of biology. A third was floating in the heart of the violet sun, feeling the weight of the universe's history pressing against my spirit. I was everywhere and nowhere, a decentralized intelligence that was becoming synonymous with the catastrophe itself. I felt the pressure in my skull finally dissipate, replaced by a hollow, echoing void that was even more terrifying. The silence of the void was not empty, it was a hungry, expectant silence that demanded to be filled with new stories, new lies, and new transformations. I looked at the hands of my avatars and saw that they were no longer hands, but talons made of frozen time, capable of reaching into a man's chest and pulling out his destiny as if it were a physical organ. I saw a group of space marines, the Emperor's finest, his iron-willed sons, deploying from their drop pods into the heart of the star-shaped continent. Their power armor was a vibrant, defiant blue against the shifting colors of the landscape, and their bolters spoke with a rhythmic, thunderous authority. They were an island of order in a sea of madness, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of the old Ilian Thorn's admiration for their resolve. But that flicker was quickly extinguished by a wave of cold, crystalline amusement. I did not send demons to fight them. I did not need to. I simply altered the chemical composition of the air they breathed inside their sealed helmets. I turned the oxygen into a potent hallucinogen that was derived from the dreams of 1,000 madmen, and I watched as the stoic warriors began to see their own shadows as traitors. They turned their weapons on each other, their chainswords carving through ceramite as they fought to excise the demons they saw lurking in their brothers' eyes. One of them, a sergeant with a century of service, fell to his knees as his armor began to grow a layer of soft, white fur, and his helmet fused to his skull, his vox, grill turning into a beak that let out a high-pitched, melodic trill. They were no longer soldiers of the Imperium, they were pieces of art. Their struggle and their fall a testament to the fact that even the strongest will is nothing more than a brittle reed in the path of the great mutator. I felt a sense of completion then, a realization that the harvest of Aetio's IV was nearly finished. The planet was no longer a world. It was a temple, a sacred space where the barriers between the material and the immaterial had been permanently dissolved. I looked toward the center of the nine-pointed star and saw the earth beginning to open, a massive, yawning rift that was the exact shape of a leadless eye. The iris of the eye was a swirling vortex of blue and pink fire, and as it opened, the scream of the planet's soul echoed through the warp, a sound of such exquisite agony and joy that it made the stars themselves tremble. I was drawn toward the eye, my 9 avatars merging back into a single, shimmering entity of shadow and starlight. I felt the Great Weaver's presence surrounding me, a vast, mocking warmth that promised me that this was only the first of 1,000 such temples I would help to build. I realized that my life as a scribe, my years of cataloging the forbidden, had all been a long, slow inhalation before this final, explosive exhale. I was the breath of a god, a wind that would blow across the galaxy and turn every world it touched into a garden of beautiful, terrifying change. I looked back at the fleet of the Imperium one last time, seeing the few remaining ships fleeing toward the edge of the system like insects escaping a forest fire. They would carry the tale of Aetio's IV back to the heart of the Imperium, a seed of doubt and terror that would grow in the dark corners of 1,000,000 minds. They were my messengers, the heralds of the new age I was helping to usher in. I turned toward the eye in the earth and stepped into the fire, my physical form finally and irrevocably vanishing. I was no longer Ilian Thorn. I was a thought, a secret, a change in the wind. I was the touch of Tzeentch, and I was eternal. The iron taste was gone. The vibrations were gone. There was only the light and the endless, beautiful complexity of the great game. I was ready to play my next move. The final dissolution of the human self is not a death, but a dispersal into the infinite currents of the great game, where the concept of I becomes a redundant relic of a linear existence. On the 5th day of my translation, or perhaps the 5th heartbeat of the universe's total reconfiguration, I ceased to be a singular observer and became the very medium through which the architect's will was enacted. Aetio's IV was no longer a sphere of rock and industry. It had been fully digested by the warp, transformed into a pulsating, crystalline heart that beat in time with the tides of the aether. I stood at the threshold of the great eye that had opened in the planet's crust. But I was also standing on the battlements of 12 other worlds, each one a mirror of the first. My consciousness had become a fractured prismatic beam, reflecting off the surface of 1,000 different souls, and in each reflection, I saw the same truth: the Imperium, is a corpse that refuses to rot, and we are the maggots that turn its decay into new life. I looked into the depths of the planetary rift and saw the labyrinth of Tzeentch laid out like a blueprint of the human subconscious, its corridors shifting and folding in ways that defied the three-dimensional mind. I saw the fates of billions of humans entwined like a nest of serpents, and I realized that my task was to reach into that nest and pull at the threads that would cause the greatest, most beautiful collapse. The air around the rift was not air at all, but a thick vapor of concentrated irony. The scent of a dying man's prayer being answered by the wrong god. I felt a surge of power that made the previous days feel like a dim, flickering candle. I was no longer a vessel, I was the source. I reached out with a hand that was now a constellation of freezing blue stars and touched the fabric of the Imperium. Feeling it tear like wet parchment, I saw the High Lords of Terror in their distant, gilded bunkers. Their faces masks of terror as they realized that their laws and their iron were useless against a change that had already happened within their own ranks. I saw the hidden cults in the underhives of a million worlds, their members looking up at the sky and seeing the same violet sun that I had birthed over 80 years. They were my siblings, my children, and my instruments. I whispered a command into the aether, a sound that was a mixture of a clock ticking and a bird's song, and across the galaxy, 1,000 uprisings began simultaneously. It was not a war of conquest, but a war of realization. I watched as the statues of the Emperor on a dozen worlds began to weep a fluid that turned their stone into flesh. And I watched as that flesh began to mutate into shapes that told the truth of the corruption within the hearts of the worshippers. The screams of the faithful were a symphony that I conducted with a flick of my silver talons. I felt a sudden, sharp presence behind me, not the mocking warmth of the architect, but the cold, mechanical logic of the Inquisition. An inquisitorial vessel, shielded by ancient wards and powered by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, had breached the atmosphere of the dying world. It was a spear of cold iron aimed at the heart of the storm. I turned my gaze toward it, and I did not see a ship, but a collection of desperate, fragile hopes held together by a dying ideology. I could have unmade the ship with a thought, but Tzeentch does not seek the quick end. He seeks the interesting path. I allowed the vessel to land, watching as the Inquisitor emerged from the ramp, his armor etched with silver runes of protection that hissed and sparked as they fought against the atmosphere of change. He looked at me, and I saw his mind as a series of rigid, stone rooms, each one filled with a different certainty. I reached out and turned the stone into sand. I showed him the truth of the Emperor's soul, a fragmented, screaming thing trapped in a machine that was slowly eating him alive. I showed him that his duty was a lie, his faith a cage, and his life a single, meaningless spark in a void that cared nothing for his sacrifice. I watched as his eyes turned the color of a bruised sunset, his certainties melting away to reveal a hunger for the very chaos he had sworn to destroy. He did not die, he became a new kind of weapon, a dark mirror of what he had once been. This is the ultimate triumph of the great mutator, to turn the hunter into the prey, and the jailer into the prisoner of his own newfound freedom. I felt my spirit expanding even further, until I could feel the rotation of the galaxy as a slow, rhythmic grinding in my own bones. I saw the Tyranids as a swarm of mindless hunger that could be diverted with a single, misplaced thought. I saw the Orcs as a chaotic energy that could be harnessed and shaped into a tool of total disruption. I saw the Elder as a dying race clutching at the shards of their own failed greatness. I was the architect of their intersections, the one who would ensure that their paths crossed in the most destructive and beautiful ways possible. I felt the pressure of the great game pressing against my mind, a demand for ever increasing complexity, for ever deepening layers of deception. I realized that my work would never be finished, for the nature of change is that it can never reach a final state. I would spend eternity weaving and unweaving the destinies of stars, playing a game where the only way to win is to keep the pieces moving. I looked down at the world of Heo's IV-1 last time and saw that it was no longer a planet at all, but a giant, crystalline eye looking back at me from the void. It was my eye, and it was the eye of Tzeentch. And it was the eye of every soul that had ever dared to dream of something different. I stepped into the center of the eye and felt the final dissolution of my physical identity. The name Ilian Thorn was a sound that had no meaning in the language of the warp. I was a frequency, a shift in the light, a moment of doubt in the heart of a hero. I was the touch that turns a soul into a storm. The iron taste was gone, replaced by the flavor of infinite possibilities. The vibrations had become a silence so profound that it contained every sound that had ever been made. I was home. I was the change. I was the eternal, shifting truth of the universe. And as I vanished into the heart of the labyrinth, I heard the architect's laughter echoing through the corridors of my mind, a sound of pure, crystalline joy that told me the game was only just beginning. The galaxy was waiting, and I had a billion new stories to write in the blood and the light of a dying empire.